issues earlier in the week, so this is a late recording. I apologize for anyone that was not able to meet the needs to dial in earlier. This is Laura Ciceri, and today what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the significant findings that we had at Supply Chain Insights for the year 2017. Each month we tender a quantitative study, and we also then try to take that study and to triangulate it to business results. And when we do that, we build infographics and we share the data with the open source community. So this is our research and review webinar. And what we're going to do today is we're going to basically talk through the significant findings. One of the things that we worked on during the year was the forecast for technologies at the confluence of technologies. We do this in our annual conference. So we were looking at the intersection of blockchain, streaming data, 3D printing, robotics, wearables and mobility, cognitive computing, and open source analytics. One of the things that we found in our network of networks work is that blockchain is starting with some very young pilots. We are finding pilots that are one-to-many in track and trace. We're finding some pilots that are very young in cold chain, but not a lot of pilots, but a lot of talk. We found that 7% of companies are looking at cognitive computing, and there's a progression of cognitive computing from projects to engines and decision support to replacing decision support. Most of the 7% are more focused on project work, on data lakes. The replacement of the decision support engines will come later within the next 5 years, but still we're very early here as well. Wearables and mobility, we had a great presentation at our conference with AGCO that had actually worked on the replacement of tablets and phones in the factory setting, and it's available on our website. And we are actually seeing a lot of work on digital manufacturing and wearables and mobility. And of course, robotics continues to be very, very successful in manufacturing and warehousing. We had a great presentation at our conference about that as well. And streaming data on Apache Spark is starting to really take hold. The streaming data architectures to be able to take sensor data and drive decisions are probably the most aggressive investments of this group. Now, when we ask companies to look at the top 5 trends impacting supply chains today versus 2030, we see that there is decreasing excitement around static data projects. These are things like data visualization or visibility in a traditional sense, or big data analytics lakes. What we see is increasing interest in the coalescence of technologies. Use of unstructured data. I was with a client earlier this week where we were talking about the mining of quality data and operator interface data and MES data to be able to look at root cause effect for quality. We're also seeing a lot of work around Internet of Things, machine learning, blockchain, and hyperledger as people are starting to do their pilots. Blockchain requires some management of the master data as the blocks are read, and it's a good use case for machine learning. Likewise, Internet of Things, as it ties to blockchain, we've got to be careful what we write on the blocks, and there's a lot of work going on around blockchain and Internet of Things and what that's going to look like. We're finding that we have to be very discretionary about what we write on the blocks, because the blockchain technologies that we have today are not able to handle all of the data unless we are able to write selectively to the block. We also did some work on supply chain finance. This was actually one of my very favorite studies of the year. And we found out that 88% of companies have an ERP system, and only 29% of companies can easily get to total supply chain cost. And if you follow our research here, what we find is that many of the industries like food or household products as an industry are actually going backwards in the ability to manage operating margin in the increase of complexity. And one of the things that we find is that when companies can see and measure total cost, they're able to really buck that trend on management of cost with eroding operating margins in the industry. So many people think that if they have an ERP system that they can get to supply chain cost easily. But the ERP system has to be built with this design in mind. And many people will focus on more transactional systems, thinking that, if they focus on the transactions, procure to pay, order to cash, and functional metrics, that they'll be able to get to total cost. But the caution here is that that's not so easy. So when we implement ERP, we've really got to think about what is total cost? How do we measure total cost? How do we get the cost information we need out of the tables and design with this in mind? Now, the other thing we found is that with companies, 77% of companies have an S&OP process. And if you've followed our research in prior years, when companies are mature in S&OP, they're more agile, meaning that they have the same cost, quality, and customer service given a level of demand and supply volatility. They are also able to balance the S with the OP, and they're able to get to data. 1/3 of companies can get to what if analysis. So one of the major drivers in the gap between having technology and being effective is the ability to have what if analysis and the ability to have a tool that can be used by the whole organization. So many of the S&OP tools are designed for planners, but as you think about the people that need to use S&OP tools, it's just not planners, but it are the people that come into work on S&OP processes on a part-time basis or executives. And so there is an increasing dissatisfaction as S&OP gains recognition to be able to improve usability for a wider audience. The other piece is we thought that there could be a possibility that if companies had a supply chain finance group and they were more mature in S&OP and they were more mature in ERP, that we would see that they're better at total cost. And that is not true. What we found was that many of the supply chain finance teams were focused more on what I'm going to call meddling with the supply chain, increasing payments, really lacking the understanding of how to manage the supply chain as a complex system. And again, our research continues to show that 1/3 of companies roughly have a supply chain center of excellence, and about 1 in 2 consider the supply chain center of excellence to be effective. The main issue with that is that most companies don't stop and define what is supply chain excellence. And that may sound silly, but it's really a deep topic. And often when companies go through mergers and acquisitions, company employees will come from different companies with very different definitions of supply chain, very different definitions of supply chain excellence. And so without really clearly defining it, they'll be marching to the tune of different drums. The other piece that we thought could drive better cost was a very active supplier development program. And you can see that 1/3 of companies have supplier development, 14% consider this to be effective. And so, we've got gaps here, even though we got programs and processes that are in place. The total cost come down to the management of source, make, and deliver together, and the ability to have all of these systems working in concert. And when I say systems, I'm just not talking about technologies. I'm talking about processes with technologies, that we're very good at the balance in S&OP, we're very good at the what if analysis in S&OP, and that we connect planned orders coming out of sales and operations planning into aggregate buying strategies for orchestration across the company. And also that the supply chain finance group understands that the supply chain is a complex system to be managed, and that the supply chain center of excellence has a clear definition of what is excellence, and that supplier development is working on supply chain as a network. Now, the gaps are large, but one of the issues of why this is so important is, if we look at commodity volatility, and let's just sit back and say that supply chain as a practice going across source, make, and deliver was defined in 1982. And in the period of the 1990s, we had 3% growth and fairly low commodity volatility. And the decade of 2000 to 2010, we entered into the recession in 2007. Growth slowed to a little over 1%, but the level of volatility was pretty slow. In the end of the 2006 to 2007 period, because there was a lot of traditional marketing work, we had a lot more complexity in the organization with localized assortment, localized programs, adding items to the item master. We saw about 38% more items on the item master of food and household products. And we also saw a lot more personalization of products as Amazon gained steam. But what's really interesting to me is that last decade was about complexity increasing in the channel. This decade has been about management of supplier volatility and supplier viability. So when we think about volatility, we've got to think about how do we connect planned orders coming out of supply chain planning, the tactical space, to aggregate buying strategies, and then how do we orchestrate bill of materials, contract manufacturing, and start to actually plan by design so that we can look at how do we plan the network, how do we connect supply chain planning systems to network design, and start to really make conscious choices to connect sourcing to manufacturing and distribution decisions. Now, in supply chain definition, each organization defines it differently, and 1/3 of companies have manufacturing reporting to supply chain, 1/3 of companies have procurements reporting to supply chain, and only about 28% of companies do we find source, make, and deliver reporting to the supply chain leader. So there's often a big gap between the purchase and the commodity strategies for direct materials and the management of manufacturing and the management of distribution. The coordination of source, make, and deliver is better in high tech and is not as good in process-based industries. And so as you look at commodity volatility, you get an appreciation of why it's so important for us to step back and think about management of source, make, and deliver together and the output of the planning process to be able to drive aggregate buying strategies and the need to orchestrate alternate bills of material, contract manufacturing, change and push-pull strategies in S&OP, and why the gaps in S&OP with the lack of what-if analysis and the lack of tools that can be used by larger groups is a barrier. So this is the decade of volatility. It's also the decade of supply chain disruption. We did this study in supply chain finance where we asked about 2016, the number of disruptions, the number and impact on reporting. And of course, we did this study at the beginning of the year, so we had to ask in 2017 about 2016. And we found that 84% of companies had some disruptions. And we find that companies do better on disruptions when they're natural disasters or hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., floods, because we have processes in place that people can swing to action. Where we struggle to be able to manage disruptions are on supplier viability, the ability to sense supplier issues, supplier quality issues, and it's taken us 6 to 8 weeks to be able to sense a quality issue in the field and to be able to recall, and on average it's taking about 10 days for companies to actually successfully do a recall in most industries. So disruptions of quality, disruptions of suppliers, disruption of the network are much harder. And 50% included these in financial reporting. So we had 5 on average, and 2 were actually so big that they were material and they were included in financial reporting. So we see this trend increasing of disruptions and the impact on material events, even though we have a lot of risk management work and we have a lot of work on network design. Most of the issue lies with the fact that we're still very functional. We're not using our network tools in concert with sales and operations planning and planning processes. and we're not looking at how we tie planning processes to procurement, and we're not looking at how we orchestrate the probability of demand across the network, not just numbers. So the ability to have what if analysis, range analysis on demand, probability of demand, and to be able to translate this is an opportunity as we get into the redefinition of supply chain planning with cognitive computing, which will be within the next 5 years. We're already starting to see it, to be able to sense, learn, and act, and to be able to work on structured and unstructured data. So supply chain disruptions increasing, supplier volatility increasing, supplier viability more of an issue. We still are not able to get to total cost. And that brings us to talent. And this was one of the projects that I really enjoyed this year, where we had 600 responses on our supply chain talent survey. And we wanted to know which companies had the most satisfied employees and what type of employees were the most satisfied. And we looked at it by group, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And I'm a baby boomer, and by and large, baby boomers are the most satisfied in supply chains today, and significantly so. And you see the red circle, which represents the significance of the differences. And then Gen X and millennials are less satisfied, but overall, people are pretty satisfied with supply chain jobs. And equal for male and female. The vendors are more satisfied than the end users, and the academics are more satisfied than the vendors, which makes you think that, we've got a need to really focus on the Gen X and the millennials in manufacturing and distribution and retail, the tough jobs in supply chain of business users, so that we have greater satisfaction there and fewer of those employees move to the vendor community, and we're able to improve the satisfaction. Now, when we think about the ability to manage the supply chain in the face of all this volatility and also the disruptions, we also have to think about alignment. And today, we continue to see that we have large gaps between marketing and operations. And we also have large gaps between sales and operations. The commercial teams and the operations teams are not set up to win when operations is focused on cost and sales and marketing are focused more on growth strategies. We continue to see that alignment is a barrier in the management of EBITDA or cost of goods or operating margin, and that companies that are more aligned and more focused on total cost and more focused on the management of source, make, and deliver are able to drive the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns to a greater degree. We also find that companies that have higher satisfaction of employees are able to have a significant cost advantage in the market on either EBITDA or operating margin. And so many times people think about employees as an expense, and really we should use this data to think about employees as an investment and to really start to work on the alignment issues and to bring a balanced portfolio and scorecard to the organization. Now, sometimes people say millennials are lazy, that, millennials have too high of a want index, what they want. And, when we looked at the supply chain talents and what millennials want, they want balance, and they want to really drive the balance and work-life balance. They're not as willing as boomers to, have less balance. And they also want the potential to advance. It's terribly ironic to me that supply chain management is a fairly young skill and a fairly young curriculum. And, when I entered supply chain management in the 1990s, we didn't have a clue what the supply chain organization would look like. And it's still evolving. But millennials want a well-defined career path. They want to know what's going to happen, and they're going to vote with their feet for companies that can give them a well-defined career path with the potential to advance and the potential for training and good mentors, and they want coaching and they want interns and co-ops. So that will make a difference in the ability to pull the students that you want out of schools and to retain millennials after you do those new hires. Now, the challenges that companies have is that, the new ways of working, the next generation supply chain processes are tough. They're tough to design, they're tough to invest in. How do we think about new technologies? And the millennials don't like the user interface, some of the processes that are in place in the organization, and they're pushing hard. And the baby boomers are far more satisfied, are like, well, I don't really see the difference. But baby boomers really want change in this area. Now, when we look at the top 5 skills, one of the gaps is the ability to think outside the box. So, for academics, as we think about employees entering the workforce, one of the things that we should be thinking about is how do we build creative problem solving into the development of students and help them to be able to not only understand math and systems engineering, but also to be able to think out of the box and solve problems in a more unique way. So when we think about, supply chain talent, when we think about the evolution of processes, the ability to manage cost, we have some significant challenges ahead of us. And part of it comes to aligning, to be clear on supply chain strategy, to be clear on supply chain excellence, and to embrace the new ways of working with digital strategies. I've been working with a number of companies that are working on, let's take the new technologies that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar, and let's start to drive improvement. And that requires us to innovate at the edge to be able to drive adoption at the core, almost a parallel path. So we still need to do the traditional supply chain planning systems, the ERP upgrades, the MES systems on the factory floor. We still need to continue those roadmaps and evolution. But on the edge, we can find an exciting project and a scrappy team, and we can experiment with cognitive computing or Internet of Things. And to bring the innovation at the edge to the core, what we need to be able to do is to have stage gate processes, much like what's in production of the process for new product launch, so that there's governance about this should move forward or this should stop, it's not ready for prime time. And we've got to focus on real cooperation and partnership with best of breed providers where a lot of this new innovation is happening. The innovation of blockchain and cognitive computing is causing the evolution of new providers that give us great opportunities, but we've got to be able to partner with them. And that requires almost a new mindset to be able to deal with a vendor that is less mature in their processes, who may not understand the world of a large corporation that's manufacturing, and to be able to partner and work with them on the co-development of processes. So with that, let's see what questions we have from the audience. If you can put in your questions in the chat panel. Next year, we're going to be doing some research on the evolution of analytics. We'll be publishing the analytics report in January. We'll be looking at how many companies are working on Hadoop pilots, how many supply chain leaders understand terms like Spark and Kafka, and we'll also be looking at how satisfied companies are with analytics. We'll be redoing our risk survey. We'll be starting our demand management work where we're doing a share group so that companies can compare notes on new forms of analytics tools and how they're affecting the demand planning process. We're continuing to do our work on Network of Networks. We have 5 groups that are working, one on logistics, ETA, one on track and trace, one on supplier onboarding, one on European invoicing, and then we're considering what we do on the fifth one about do we do one on cryptocurrency and supply chain finance? We're not sure, but that group will meet again in April, and the demand planning share group will meet in February. So if you're interested, let us know. And we will be taking all of that work to the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit in September, where we'll be showcasing blockchain, cognitive computing, and Internet of Things architectures and case studies. The other research that we'll be doing will be continuing the work on talent, and in the summer we will continue to triangulate what factors and choices in supply chain translate to the highest business results. If you follow our research, this year we studied 1,500 variables. We looked at architectures, technologies, consultants, how companies were organized, and the only correlation we could find was that companies that were better in the investment in talent were able to improve cost. We also found that companies that had clearer inventory targets were able to drive improvement in inventory. And that's not so surprising, but the ability to have more satisfied employees had a significant correlation to cost. Was both a pleasing insight for me as well as one that I really embrace because I believe in organizational development. So this year we will continue to do our work on data mining and being able to look at the cause and effect. And in June, we'll continue the work on the supply chains to admire to look at which companies are driving the greatest results in supply chain excellence. So follow us here, engage with us. You can find us online at Supply Chain Insights. I write on the blog Supply Chain Shaman. We share all of our data openly, and we also invite guest bloggers to join with us at beatfusion.com. We also write on LinkedIn, I write on Forbes, and we do monthly webinars, which we're rolling out. So thanks for joining our webinar today, and we hope to see you on our future webinars. Until next time, this is Laura Ciceri.